It started with a boy from Philadelphia who spent his life outrunning bullets, enemies, and the law. For years, Jack Legs Diamond survived everything New York threw at him, until one quiet morning in Albany when his luck finally snapped. This is the true story of a gangster who became a myth, and a myth that became a warning. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts about today's topic in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. It began in the brick and soot neighborhoods of Philadelphia at the turn of a new century. On July 10th, 1897, a boy named Jack Diamond came into the world. His parents, Sarah and John Moran, had crossed the Atlantic years earlier, carrying the same hopes as thousands of Irish immigrants who came seeking steady work and a chance to build a quiet life. Philadelphia gave them that stability, at least for a while. They raised their sons in a working-class district where the streets were crowded, the pay was small, and the future never promised much. Jack and his younger brother Eddie spent their childhood moving between cramped row houses and schoolrooms where the teachers were overwhelmed and the lessons rarely stuck. Neither boy took naturally to academics. They struggled through grade school, restless in their desks, drawn more to the noise outside the windows than the chalkboard in front of them. It wasn't delinquency yet, only a hint of the turbulence that would come. Inside the home, the real anchor of the family was Sarah, but her health had been failing for years. Arthritis bent her joints, infections weakened her body, and the pain grew harder to hide. By the winter of 1913, the illness had taken its toll. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, she died from complications brought on by a severe fever. Jack was 16, Eddie was 14. Whatever innocence they still had evaporated that night. Their father couldn't keep the household together. Grief, poverty, and the weight of raising two boys alone pushed him toward a decision that would change the course of their lives. He left Philadelphia and took Jack and Eddie north, settling them in Brooklyn, New York, and into a city where the skyline was climbing faster than the law could keep up, where neighborhood gangs offered the kind of structure a broken family could no longer provide. By the time the Moran family stepped off the train and onto those Brooklyn streets, Jack Diamond's world had shifted. The quiet struggle of Philadelphia was behind him. Ahead waited the noise of a borough built on ambition, rivalry, and the promise that a clever young man could rise one way or another. When the Moran family reached Brooklyn, the borough was swelling with immigrants, hustlers, and kids who learned early that the street could raise you faster than any parent. Jack Diamond was one of them. 16 years old, carrying anger he didn't know how to name, he drifted through the neighborhoods looking for a place where he fit. School no longer held his attention, and the quiet grief at home grew heavier with each passing month. Brooklyn's alleys had their own way of shaping a young man. Jack fell in with boys who had already learned the rhythm of petty crime, picking pockets near the ferry landings, running errands for older crooks, navigating the unwritten rules of the street. It wasn't long before his world stretched beyond the East River and into Manhattan, where the underworld was thicker and the stakes were higher. Somewhere between those restless walks and late-night schemes, Jack found his way to a gang known as the Hudson Dusters. They operated out of the West Side, an unruly crew known more for their recklessness than their discipline. To outsiders, they were a nuisance, but to a young man looking for belonging, they were a doorway. The Dusters offered camaraderie, money, and a reputation, small as it might be. Jack didn't hesitate. By February 1914, he crossed a line he couldn't step back from. He was arrested for breaking into a jewelry store, a burglary that showed he wasn't content to linger on the edges anymore. He wanted a bigger cut of the life he saw around him, and he was willing to take the risks that came with it. The charge didn't slow him down. If anything, it marked the beginning of a pattern that would follow him into adulthood. Bold moves, dangerous choices, and an uncanny ability to survive the consequences. Through the mid-1910s, his work with the Dusters sharpened him. He learned who to watch, who to fear, and who to imitate. Manhattan's criminal circles were tightening, and Jack Diamond was becoming one of their young regulars, fast on his feet, quick to act, and already building the reputation that would one day echo across the city. The boy from Philadelphia was gone. In his place stood someone harder, more determined, and drawn to the adrenaline that came with every illegal job. Brooklyn had given him a new world, and Jack Diamond was already learning how to climb it. By 1917, the United States was bracing itself for war overseas. Posters lined the streets, recruiters filled the armories, and young men from every corner of New York were being swept into uniforms. Jack Diamond was 20 now, restless and drifting, his future uncertain. The army offered structure, a paycheck, and perhaps a chance to outrun the trouble he'd already found. So he enlisted. But the discipline of military life didn't hold him for long. Jack had spent too many years moving on his own terms, answering to no one, and following whatever impulse cut through the noise of the day. The army was the opposite of that world. Orders came constantly, mistakes carried consequences, and every morning looked exactly like the one before it. Somewhere between drills, inspections, and the looming threat of deployment, Jack's instinct kicked in, the instinct to run. He went AWOL, walking away from his post and leaving the army behind. For a while, he stayed hidden, moving through cities where deserters blended into the crowd. But the law caught up with him, as it always did when the stakes were high. He was tried for desertion, convicted, and sent to one of the harshest destinations the military could offer: the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. The prison was built for men who broke army code, stone walls, endless routines, and guards who believed every inmate needed breaking down before they could be built back up. Jack served 2 years of a 3 to 5 year sentence, long enough for the days to blur together and the discipline he once rejected to become impossible to ignore. Leavenworth didn't soften him, but it changed him. He learned patience, learned to watch before acting, learned that survival wasn't always about speed. When he finally walked out of the prison in 1921, he carried a new hardness with him, one forged behind bars rather than on the streets. He returned to New York a free man, stepping back into a city that was shifting under the weight of prohibition and fast money. The underworld was beginning to reorganize itself, building an economy around banned liquor, protection rackets, and political influence. And waiting in that world, whether he knew it or not, was the man who would shape the next chapter of his life: Arnold Rothstein. Jack Diamond was no longer the kid from Philadelphia, nor the runaway soldier with a sentence over his head. He was a survivor with something to prove, returning to a city that was about to give him the opportunity he'd been hungry for. When Jack Diamond walked out of Leavenworth in 1921, New York was ready for men like him. Prohibition had turned the city into a marketplace for every form of illegal opportunity. Speakeasies hid behind unmarked doors, trucks moved liquor through midnight streets, and fortunes rose in the shadows faster than they ever could in daylight. At the center of that world stood Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein wasn't a street brawler. He was a businessman in a tailored suit, the kind of man who turned crime into an industry. He financed bootlegging operations, fixed sporting events, and managed gamblers, thieves, and killers the way a banker managed portfolios. When Diamond returned to the city, he caught Rothstein's attention, a young man with nerve, speed, and a streak of fearlessness that made him useful. Rothstein brought him on as hired muscle, bodyguard, enforcer, a man who handled the conversations others were too cautious to have. Jack accepted the work without hesitation. Rothstein's payroll meant security, influence, and an introduction to the people who shaped the future of organized crime. Those introductions mattered. In back rooms thick with cigar smoke, Jack crossed paths with men who were still carving their names into the underworld. Charles Lucky Luciano, not yet the legendary architect of the American Mafia, but already ambitious and calculating. George Fatty Walsh, loud, Irish, and connected to half the bootleggers in Manhattan. Salvatore Charlie Green, Entrata, another familiar face in Rothstein's orbit. These weren't just associates, they were the kind of men who set the tone for an empire. Working for Rothstein, Jack learned the mechanics of the trade. He escorted shipments, settled disputes, and handled collections when conversation failed. His confidence grew. So did his reputation. People began to notice the way he moved through a room, the speed that earned him the nickname Legs, and the quiet assurance that came from knowing one of New York's most powerful men had placed a hand on his shoulder. Between 1921 and 1924, Jack Diamond evolved. He wasn't a street tough anymore. He was a recognized figure in an emerging criminal network, a man linked to names that would someday become legends. The underworld was shifting toward organization and hierarchy, and Diamond stood close to the center of that transition. If Philadelphia shaped him and Brooklyn hardened him, Rothstein's world refined him. It taught him how the business of crime really worked. Not through fists alone, but through alliances, favors, and the confidence to take risks when the odds were stacked against you. Jack Diamond was becoming someone the city would remember, and soon the bullets would start flying to prove it. By 1924, Jack Diamond had become a familiar name in the liquor racket, the kind of figure who moved fast, talked little, and made enemies without hesitation. Prohibition had turned trucks loaded with booze into rolling treasure chests, and everyone in the city wanted a piece. Jack was no exception. That year, he made a move on a shipment belonging to a rival outfit. It was the kind of hijacking that happened all the time, quick, brutal, and usually handled before the sun rose. But this time, the rival crew was waiting. Maybe they got a tip. Maybe they recognized Jack's pattern. Whatever the reason, when he closed in on the trucks, the night exploded. A shotgun blast tore through the darkness, ripping into him at close range. Buckshot punched into his body, knocking him off his feet and leaving him bleeding on the ground. For most men, that would have been the end. A hijacking gone wrong, a silent death on the side of a dark road. But Jack Diamond wasn't most men. He survived, badly hurt, but alive. The recovery was slow, the pain unforgettable, yet the effect on his reputation was immediate. Word spread through Manhattan that Rothstein's young enforcer had taken a blast meant to tear him apart and managed to pull through. Men in the underworld respected nerve, but they revered survival. The 1924 ambush marked the beginning of a strange pattern in Jack's life. Every time a gun turned in his direction, he walked away from the scene, battered but breathing. It was the first moment when people started whispering that he couldn't be killed, that death had tried to take him and failed. For Jack Diamond, the shotgun blast wasn't just a close call, it was the opening chapter of a legend, the story of a man who kept getting shot, kept getting up, and kept moving deeper into a world where bullets were as common as the bootleg liquor he protected. And New York was only beginning to learn his name. By the late 1920s, Jack Diamond had traded small-time hijackings for a front-row seat in one of New York's bloodiest rivalries. His circle now included Jacob Little Orgen, a tough, ambitious racketeer who controlled labor unions and garment district shakedowns on Manhattan's Lower East Side. Orgen wasn't subtle. He built power through intimidation, fists, and a steady rotation of armed men who kept his enemies in check. Jack's brother, Eddie, worked as Orgen's bodyguard. But in the fall of 1927, Eddie wasn't available, and Jack stepped in as a substitute. It was supposed to be routine: walk the boss through his territory, keep an eye on the corners, and show anyone watching that Orgen still had muscle around him. On October 16th, 1927, the routine shattered. Orgen and Diamond were making their way down Norfolk Street when three young gunmen stepped out of the crowd. They didn't hesitate. They opened fire in broad daylight, the blasts echoing off the tenement walls. Orgen took the worst of it, hit repeatedly, collapsing almost immediately. Diamond caught 2 bullets below the heart, the kind of wounds that left most men dying on the sidewalk. But he didn't fall. Not right away. People later said he moved with pure instinct, clutching his chest and fighting to stay upright. When the gunman fled, Orgen lay dying, the last moments of his empire slipping away with him. Diamond was rushed to Bellevue Hospital, his survival once again hanging by a thread. Doctors worked on him while detectives filled the hallway outside, waiting for answers. When Jack finally woke, the police were ready. They wanted names, motives, anything that could tie the hit to the growing tension in the garment rackets. But Jack refused to give them a single word. He denied knowing who pulled the triggers, denied recognizing any rival crews, denied everything. To the police, silence looked like guilt. They suspected Jack might have been part of an internal power play, someone who positioned himself near Orgen not to protect him, but to stand out of the way. A homicide charge was filed, thin as tissue paper, and eventually dropped for lack of evidence. Jack walked out of Bellevue without a conviction, carrying 2 more scars and another tale of survival. Meanwhile, Orgen's murder reshaped the city's rackets. Louis Buchalter and Jacob Gura Shapiro, 2 men who had been circling Orgen's operations for years, moved in almost immediately. They took over the labor unions, expanded their influence, and built the foundation for the criminal syndicate that would later be known as Murder, Inc. The shooting on the Lower East Side didn't just end Orgen's reign. It marked a shift in the underworld's balance of power. And for Jack Diamond, it cemented a growing legend. No matter how close death came, he kept stepping back into the light. By the late 1920s, Manhattan was a battlefield disguised as a nightlife boom. Prohibition had turned the city into a maze of hidden bars, brokered deals, and truck routes guarded like military supply lines. If liquor was the currency, violence was the cost of doing business. And Jack Legs Diamond was ready to pay it. After the Orgen shooting, Diamond shifted his focus downtown, carving out a foothold in Manhattan's crowded bootlegging economy. He wasn't the largest operator, but he was aggressive, unpredictable, and unafraid to make enemies. One of those enemies loomed larger than the others, Dutch Schultz. Schultz controlled Harlem's beer distribution with an iron grip, and he was pushing south. Diamond was moving north. Their territories collided somewhere in the middle, and neither man believed in compromise. The conflict simmered in back rooms and brief conversations on street corners, territorial lines drawn in a city where lines never lasted long. Diamond needed supply, and he needed it steady. Europe became his target, but his attempt to source narcotics and beer overseas fizzled. What he did manage to secure was liquor, barrels tossed overboard in New York Harbor, drifting toward the Long Island shoreline. It was a strange system, but it worked. Kids along the beaches knew the routine. If they found a barrel bobbing in the surf, they dragged it to shore and earned a nickel from Diamond's men. A small fortune for a child and a steady flow of illegal booze for Jack. With product coming in and demand growing, Diamond settled into his new headquarters, the Hotsy Totsy Club on Broadway. He held partial ownership, and the club became both a nightlife hotspot and a front for his operations. Behind the laughter, the dancing, and the glow of the stage lights, Diamond oversaw deals, arranged shipments, and maintained alliances. But the city was crowded with men chasing the same ambitions. Schultz was one. Others circled as well, smaller outfits hungry for territory, larger crews waiting for a misstep, and corrupt officials who could be bought but never fully trusted. Diamond thrived in the chaos. He moved through the underworld with the confidence of a man who believed he could outrun trouble. And for a time, he did. Between 1927 and 1929, the bootleg wars grew louder. Trucks went missing, warehouses were hit, street corners changed hands overnight, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Jack Diamond kept building his name. The Hotsy Totsy Club stood as a monument to his rise, a place where the music drowned out the danger, and where Jack Legs Diamond smiled like a man who assumed the night couldn't touch him. But New York had a way of correcting that kind of confidence, and soon the club would become a crime scene that forced Diamond deeper into the war he helped create. By the summer of 1929, the Hotsy Totsy Club wasn't just a Broadway hotspot. It had become the beating heart of Jack Diamond's bootlegging empire, a place where money moved, deals were sealed, and tensions simmered quietly under the neon lights. But in New York's underworld, one bad night can burn down everything a man builds. That night came on July 14th, 1929. 3 drunken brawlers stumbled into the club, men loud enough and reckless enough to test the patience of any owner trying to keep order. They weren't hardened gangsters. They were ordinary troublemakers who picked the wrong room on the wrong night, with the wrong man watching. The argument started small. A shove, a raised voice. Then the fight spilled across the floor, knocking chairs aside and drawing every eye in the place. For Jack Diamond and Charles "Charlie" Green Entrata, one of his close associates, the moment felt like a threat to their territory. The Hotsy Totsy was Diamond's base of operations. Any challenge inside those walls needed to be answered fast. Gunfire cut through the chaos. When the smoke cleared, two of the brawlers, William Cassidy and Simon Walker, lay dead. The third, Peter Cassidy, was wounded but alive. And the witnesses, the people who should have filled police notebooks with details, began to vanish. The bartender disappeared. 3 waiters vanished too. Even the hat check girl was gone, later found shot to death across the river in New Jersey. It didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots. A triple shooting in a club tied to Jack Diamond wasn't something they could ignore. Detectives pressed hard, searching for survivors, questioning informants, and probing every rumor that drifted through Manhattan's back alleys. But no charges stuck. No one was willing to testify. The silence that followed was as thick as the fear that created it. Still, the police didn't need a conviction to act. The shooting had drawn too much heat, too much attention. Authorities descended on the Hotsy Totsy with one clear objective: shut it down. And they did. The club that had carried Diamond's bootlegging operation, that had given him influence and visibility, was forced to close its doors. The neon dimmed, the music stopped, and the building that once pulsed with his ambition now stood as a warning. In the Prohibition Underworld, one violent moment could wipe out months of work. For Jack Diamond, the night at the Hotsy Totsy was a turning point. It didn't end his rise, but it tightened the noose. Other gangs took notice. The police kept his name on their desk, and his enemies, already circling, began to wonder whether Diamond's luck was finally starting to thin. The club was gone, yet the war outside it was only growing louder. By 1930, Jack Diamond's world had drifted far from Broadway clubs and Manhattan's speakeasies. The pressure in the city was rising. Too many enemies, too many shootings, too many police detectives who now recognized his face the moment he stepped off a curb. So Diamond shifted his operations north into the quieter towns of Greene County and the back roads around Catskill. He wanted space. What he found instead was trouble that carried his name all the way into the courtroom. It started with a truck driver named Grover Parks. Parks was hauling a load of hard cider through Cairo, New York, the kind of shipment that sat somewhere between legal and profitable. Diamond believed the man was running liquor under someone else's protection and wanted answers. Parks didn't give him any. So Diamond and 2 of his men dragged him off the road, beat him, and kept beating him until the silence broke, or until exhaustion made the questions meaningless. When they finally released him, Parks was barely standing. Word spread quickly. Beating a man in a city alley was one thing. Torturing him in a quiet upstate town where everyone knew one another was another matter entirely. Authorities took notice. Not long after, Diamond was linked to a second incident: the kidnapping of a man named James Duncan. Details were murky, as they often were in Diamond's orbit, but the accusation was loud enough to bring him into court. He was sent to Catskill for the trial, facing the kind of rural jury that didn't care about Manhattan glamour or gangster mythology. They wanted facts. They wanted truth. And yet, once the testimony was done, once the lawyers rested their cases, Diamond heard the same word he always seemed to hear when he stood before a judge: acquitted. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, but not a relieved one. The eyes on him had multiplied. The federal government had been watching too. They pieced together the Parks beating, the Duncan kidnapping, and a pattern of interstate crime that crossed far beyond the boundaries of local law. This time there was no jury to charm, no missing witnesses, no vanished waiters or terrified employees to muddy the case. Federal prosecutors secured a conviction, and Diamond was handed a 4-year sentence. For the first time, the walls felt like they were closing in. New York law enforcement, city cops, state police, even federal agents had begun treating him not as a flashy bootlegger or a headline-making brawler, but as a target whose luck needed to run out. Every move he made upstate drew scrutiny. Every associate was questioned. Every mile he traveled put another patrol car on his tail. Diamond had escaped bullets, survived assassins, and dodged murder charges. But in 1930, the danger he faced wasn't on a dark street corner. It was in brightly lit courtrooms and the steady march of prosecutors who were building a case brick by brick. The heat was rising, and Jack Diamond was running out of places to hide. By the summer of 1930, Jack Diamond was looking for something bigger than bootlegging. The liquor wars in Manhattan had made him money, but they also dragged him into gunfights, courtrooms, and the kind of headlines that blocked every legitimate path forward. He wanted a new revenue stream, something more lucrative, more controlled, and far less seasonal than beer. That ambition sent him across the Atlantic. He boarded the ocean liner Belgenland on August the 23rd, traveling under the name John Nolan. To the passengers, he appeared to be a gambler with an easy smile and a talent for cards. Some said he won thousands in the ship's smoking room. Others claimed his winnings barely covered his drinks. Either way, he blended in. But the NYPD wasn't fooled for long. Back in New York, detectives suspected that Diamond had left the country under an alias. They didn't know which ship he boarded, so they blanketed the Atlantic with wireless telegraphs, alerting captains to be on the lookout. The message eventually reached the Belgenland, and the reply came back almost immediately. A man matching Diamond's description was on board. When the ship approached Plymouth on August 31st, Scotland Yard officers waited at the dock. They didn't bother with an interrogation. They informed Diamond he wasn't welcome on British soil. If he wanted treatment for the cure, his polite way of saying he needed rest or maybe a detox, he would have to find it elsewhere. He tried Belgium next. On September 1st, he disembarked in Antwerp and was promptly escorted to police headquarters. Belgian officials questioned him, checked his aliases, and decided they didn't want him either. Diamond claimed he planned to continue to Vichy, France, a spa town known for its mineral waters and wealthy patrons. The authorities didn't care. They put him on a train heading east. When that train crossed into Germany at Aachen, his trip came to a full stop. German police boarded the railcar, pulled him aside, and placed him under arrest as an undesirable foreigner. While Diamond waited in custody, German officials debated what to do with him. They didn't have to debate for long. On September the 6th, they reached a decision: deportation. He was driven to Hamburg and loaded onto the cargo ship Hanover, bound for the United States. For all his effort, he returned home empty-handed. The trip had been a failure, and not the quiet kind. Authorities had tracked him, flagged him, and pushed him out. Meanwhile, the men who were supposed to accompany him, Charles Entrata, Lucky Luciano, Salvatore Artidiaco, and a shadowy figure known only as Traeger, went underground in Antwerp and continued their own missions without him. Rumors began to swirl that Diamond hadn't crossed the ocean for liquor. Letters found later suggested a narcotics deal, big money, high stakes, and a guarantee that someone was getting burned. When Jack came back with no drugs, no money, and no story that made sense, suspicions hardened. Stolen funds, broken promises, betrayal. Whatever happened in Europe, it left deep cracks in his alliances. On September 23rd, Hanover reached Philadelphia. Police were waiting. Diamond was arrested the moment he stepped off the ship. But the judge offered him a deal: leave the city within the hour and the matter would be dropped. Jack agreed, walked out of the courthouse, and disappeared back into the New York underworld. He had survived the trip. But the failure followed him home. Enemies were whispering. Investors wanted answers. And the underworld was starting to wonder whether Jack Diamond had taken one gamble too many. October 1930 found Jack Diamond back in Manhattan, a city that greeted him with equal parts opportunity and gunfire. The failed European venture had bruised his standing in the underworld, and every rival who had once kept their distance now watched him with renewed ambition. In that climate, paranoia wasn't a condition, it was survival. Diamond checked into the Hotel Monticello on Manhattan's west side, a place where businessmen, drifters, and gangsters all slept under the same roof, pretending the walls could keep danger at bay. But nothing in Jack's life ever stayed quiet for long. On the night of October 12th, two men made their move. They didn't creep or sneak. They forced the door open, fast, brutal, direct. Jack was inside, unarmed, still in his pajamas. Before he could react, the room filled with muzzle flashes. 5 shots slammed into him. Not warning shots, not intimidation, kill shots. But Jack Diamond had a strange relationship with death. Bleeding, stunned, and barely conscious, he did something no one expected. He reached for the whiskey bottle on the table beside him. When police later asked how he managed to leave the room with multiple bullets in his body, he told them the same thing every time. He took 2 hard drinks, gathered himself, and started crawling. He dragged his wounded body across the floor, pushed the door open, and collapsed into the hallway. Hotel staff froze when they saw him, pale, shaking, and somehow still alive. The gunmen had already vanished, leaving nothing but the smell of gunpowder in the room behind him. An ambulance rushed him to Polyclinic Hospital, where surgeons worked through the night. 5 gunshot wounds, any of which could have ended him. But Jack held on, clinging to consciousness with the same stubbornness that marked every chapter of his life. Doctors called it remarkable, detectives called it infuriating, rivals called it impossible. To Jack Diamond, it was Tuesday. By December 30th, he was out of the hospital and back on his feet, thin, pale, but still moving, still defiant, still alive. The Hotel Monticello shooting should have ended him. Instead, it pushed his legend further into the territory of myth. The man the newspapers would soon call the clay pigeon of the underworld, because every time you fired at him, he bounced back. And somewhere out there, the men who pulled the triggers were already planning their next attempt. By the spring of 1931, Jack Diamond was living on borrowed time. The law was watching him from every angle, the newspapers were following his every move, and the underworld, once his playground, was slowly turning against him. Upstate New York had become his refuge, a place where the roads were quiet and the law moved slower. But that peace didn't last. It began with an arrest in Catskill. Detectives finally moved on the lingering case of Grover Parks, the truck driver Diamond had beaten and tortured the year before. On April 21st, Jack was taken into custody, calm, composed, and wearing the expression of a man who had stood in front of judges more often than he had stood in front of mirrors. 2 days later, he posted a $25,000 bond and walked out of the jailhouse. He didn't celebrate. Men who live under constant threat rarely do. 5 days after his release, the next attempt on his life arrived. On April 26th, Jack was dining with 3 companions at the Aratoga Inn, a quiet roadhouse perched near the edge of Cairo, New York, a place built for late dinners, not gunfights. After they finished eating, Jack stood up to leave. Before he could reach the door, gunfire erupted. 3 bullets tore into him, dropping him to the floor near the entrance. The attackers slipped away into the night. A local resident, awakened by the chaos, rushed over and loaded Jack into his car. He drove him north to Albany Medical Center, racing through the back roads with a half-conscious gangster bleeding across the back seat. At the hospital, doctors started working on him immediately. Another round of surgeries, another gamble against the odds. When he finally regained strength, Jack delivered one of the most famous lines of his life. With bandages wrapped tight around him, he looked at the attending surgeon and said, "They have not yet made the bullet that will kill me." To some, it sounded like bravado. To others, it sounded like a curse. But to those who knew Jack, it was simply the truth as he saw it. He believed the world could shoot at him all it wanted, and he'd keep standing. And for years, he had. While Jack lay in his hospital bed, the state police made their move. On May 1st, they raided 2 of his strongholds, one in Cairo and another at the Aratoga Inn itself. Hidden caches of beer and illegal liquor were uncovered, more than $5,000 worth. Barrels, bottles, equipment, everything that tied him to the bootlegging trade was piled into evidence trucks. The message was clear. Whether it was bullets or badges, the world was closing in. Jack Diamond healed yet again, but each recovery came slower, and each attack came closer to ending the myth he had built. The man who couldn't be killed was still standing, but the circle around him was tightening, and the next move he made would carry him straight into the final stretch of his violent life. By the middle of 1931, Jack Diamond was a man drowning in legal trouble. Every courtroom in New York seemed to have a file with his name on it. and every prosecutor wanted the privilege of being the one who finally put him behind bars. The bullets that had failed to kill him were being replaced by indictments, subpoenas, and sworn testimonies, things he couldn't outrun. The first major blow came in the bootlegging case he shared with Paul Quattrocchi. The two men had stood side by side in the business for years, but the law had caught up with them. In August, the state put them on trial for their role in a widespread liquor operation. Witnesses spoke, evidence was laid out, and the shadow of the Aratoga Inn shooting hung over everything like smoke. This time, the jury didn't waver. Diamond was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. A harsh verdict, but one that carried a familiar loophole: appeal. His lawyers filed the paperwork almost immediately, buying him time, something Jack had always known how to use, and use well. But while his attorneys fought in the appellate courts, another storm gathered. Federal investigators, already circling since the Grover Parks beating, renewed their efforts. They believed Diamond's operations crossed state lines. They believed he had evaded justice for too long. And they believed, rightly, that his empire was crumbling. Every move he made now was watched, logged, and pinned to a board somewhere in a federal office. Even the press was closing in. Jack had always understood the value of image. Part of his survival came from how the public saw him. A charismatic outlaw, a man who cheated death so often it bordered on folklore. In early 1931, he made a quiet deal with John O'Donnell, a reporter from the New York Daily News who Diamond considered one of the few writers he could trust. The arrangement was simple. Jack and his inner circle would talk off the record in exchange for sympathetic coverage. The paper would handle legal costs for his mistress, Marion Kiki Roberts, who was dodging authorities due to her involvement in a kidnapping case tied to Diamond. In return, she and Jack would give interviews and stories, but only to be published after his death. Diamond said it plainly, "When I'm dead, you can print this stuff." It was the kind of line a man uses when he knows the clock is running out. Meanwhile, Kiki's legal situation added another layer of danger. She had been indicted in connection with the same kidnapping that had nearly crushed Diamond. Her absence made detectives suspicious. Her loyalty made the Underworld uneasy. And her relationship with Jack, public, passionate, and often reckless, put additional pressure on his marriage and on his already strained alliances. By late 1931, the walls around Jack Diamond were closing faster than ever before. The appeals wound their way through the courts, the feds waited for their chance to pounce, and the newspapers hovered like vultures ready for headline gold. Jack had survived bullets, beatings, and betrayals, but the machinery of the law was different. It didn't fire once and flee into the night. It moved slowly, relentlessly, and without fear. And as winter approached, the man who had once outrun everything was beginning to feel the ground shift beneath him. On the evening of December 17th, 1931, Albany sat under a quiet winter cold, the kind that hung low over the city's streets and made the neon glow from tavern windows look warmer than usual. Inside a courthouse earlier that day, Jack Diamond had done what he always seemed to do. He slipped free. Another acquittal, this time on kidnapping charges that had shadowed him for months. The jury let him walk, and Jack took the verdict as an invitation to celebrate. He gathered his wife, Alice, a few friends, and Marion Kiki Roberts, the showgirl whose presence in his life made headlines and heartbreak in equal measure. They ate, drank, and replayed the events of the day with the kind of relief only a man who constantly dodged disaster could understand. The trial was behind him. The sentence he'd feared was pushed off once more. And Jack, as always, tried to believe that meant the danger had eased. But celebration was his weakness. Sometime after midnight, Jack and Kiki slipped away from the group and headed to the Kenmore Hotel on North Pearl Street, where the Rainbow Room was alive with music. The place was a slice of glamour in a working town, smoke drifting through stage lights, piano keys ringing over the sound of laughter, dancers moving between tables. It was the sort of room Jack had always gravitated toward, no matter the city. Bright, noisy, and full of people who didn't ask questions. He drank hard. He always did when he felt untouchable. By 4:30 in the morning, the drinks had caught up with him. He and Kiki left the Rainbow Room, stepping into the cold night, the streets nearly empty except for the occasional taxi coasting past the curbs. They found a cab and climbed inside, the night spinning slightly around Jack as the driver pointed the car toward Dove Street. The rooming house where he'd been staying was modest, quiet, unremarkable, and far from the glamorous hotels he'd once used as hideouts. He was in Albany for court, not business, and everything about the place reflected that. Kiki didn't stay the night. She left him at the door, heading off to her own room in the city. Jack stumbled inside alone, made it to the bed, and collapsed, still half-dressed. He didn't lock the door behind him. He didn't check the hallways or the windows. The whiskey had numbed the instincts that usually kept him alive. The man who once dodged bullets with uncanny timing now fell asleep without a care in the world, believing the danger had passed. By sunrise, he'd be dead. The final night of Jack Legs Diamond didn't end with a shootout or a chase through city streets. It ended with a man too drunk to stand, lying in a rented room in Albany, unaware that the killers who had been waiting for their moment had finally found him defenseless. The celebration was over. The legend was about to meet reality. The winter dawn was still an hour away when two men climbed the steps of 67 Dove Street in Albany. The boarding house sat silent, its tenants tucked behind thin doors and creaking floorboards. No one heard the killers arrive, no one saw them slip through the hallway, and no one inside that building knew that Jack Legs Diamond, New York's most bullet-ridden outlaw, was about to face the one ambush he couldn't outrun. Diamond lay sprawled on his bed, drunk and unconscious, still wearing his clothes from the night before. The celebration had drained the last of his instincts. He hadn't locked the door, he hadn't checked the hallway. For the first time in years, he slept without the usual paranoia tugging at him. The gunman pushed the door open and stepped inside. There was no warning shot, no whispered threat, no moment of hesitation. One man pinned Jack to the mattress. The other raised his revolver. At close range, so close the muzzle nearly touched his skin, they fired 3 rounds into the back of his head. The bullets entered just below the left ear, 2 lodged deep in the skull. One passed clean through the neck and into the bedding beneath him. No struggle, no last words, no defiance. The man who had survived more than 70 gunshot pellets and nearly a dozen slugs never opened his eyes. Minutes later, the killers slipped back out into the cold. A neighbor later reported seeing a dark-colored sedan, possibly burgundy, pull away from the curb, its license plates traced to Brooklyn. A flashlight and a .38 caliber revolver wrapped in silk were later found discarded on the lawn of St. Paul's Church, barely a mile away. The trail ended there. Inside the boarding house, the first to discover the body was the proprietor. He pushed open the door, saw the blood soaking into the mattress, and froze. Diamond had been shot so close that the wounds were small but devastating. 3 neat circles, dark and final. The proprietor didn't touch anything. He backed out, trembling, and reached for the telephone. His first call wasn't to the police, it was to the club where he knew Alice Diamond might be reached. Alice arrived before the authorities. When she walked into the room and saw her husband's body, she fell to her knees. Witnesses said she cradled his head in her lap, rocking back and forth, whispering, "I didn't do it," over and over again. Whether it was grief, guilt, or fear speaking, no one knew. But the image would follow her for the rest of her short life. Only then did the police arrive, brisk, tired, and unsurprised. Albany detectives filed into the small room, stepping around the blood-stained floorboards, taking in the sight of a man who had made their jobs harder for years. Some officers looked curious, others looked satisfied, but none looked shocked. New York City Police Commissioner Edward P. Mulrooney summed up the mood better than anyone, miles away but speaking for many. So they got him at last. It's no loss to the community, not this community anyhow. At 67 Dove Street, the body of Jack Legs Diamond was pulled from the mattress, zipped into a stretcher bag, and carried down the narrow staircase as neighbors watched through half-open doors. The man once called the clay pigeon of the Underworld had finally met a bullet he couldn't walk away from. The legend didn't end with a blaze of gunfire. It ended with the quiet click of a doorknob, the thud of 3 shots, and the sound of footsteps fading into the Albany night. The morning after Jack Diamond's murder, the city of Albany woke to a crime that felt less like a mystery and more like a message. Everyone had an idea of who killed him. Everyone had a theory, and yet the truth remained hidden beneath layers of politics, grudges, and a power structure that had ruled Albany long before Jack Diamond ever walked its streets. The first names whispered were the usual suspects. Dutch Schultz, Diamond's bitter rival from the Manhattan Bootleg wars, had every reason to want him gone. Their feud stretched across years, bloodshed, and geography. Schultz was a man who believed in efficiency, and eliminating a persistent thorn like Diamond fit his style. Some believed he sent Abraham Bo Weinberg, his trusted lieutenant, to oversee the hit. Others pointed to the Oley brothers, 2 hard-edged operators who had crossed paths with Diamond before. They had the muscle, they had the motive, and they had the willingness to do the kind of job that required precision and silence. But as the hours passed, a new theory began to take shape. One that didn't come from the underworld, but from Albany's own political machinery. At the center of it stood Dan O'Connell. O'Connell wasn't a gangster. He was the Democratic Party boss of Albany. A man whose influence stretched through every department, every ward, and every police precinct. He controlled the city's vice operations, its political appointments, and its unwritten rules. For decades, nothing happened in Albany without his approval, and Jack Diamond had crossed into his territory without permission. Years later, O'Connell spoke with the novelist William Kennedy and laid it out in the blunt, matter-of-fact tone only a man who feared no consequences could use. According to him, Diamond called one day and announced he planned to move into Albany's insurance business. Protection rackets, shakedowns, the whole Underworld catalogue. O'Connell sent a message back. Not in this city. Not now. Not ever. Diamond ignored it. O'Connell claimed that was his mistake. In the interview, O'Connell said one of his men, Billy Pryor, kept bringing Diamond around Albany, trying to help him wedge his way into local business. But he brought him around once too often. And when Jack didn't take the hint, O'Connell assigned someone to fix the problem. According to O'Connell, the man who carried out the execution was Albany Police Sergeant William Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick was no small-time patrolman. He was ambitious, respected, and deeply tied into O'Connell's political network. O'Connell described the moment plainly. Fitzpatrick saw Diamond, followed him, and warned him to keep going. A phrase that in underworld parlance meant leave town or face the consequences. Diamond stayed. Fitzpatrick acted. It was a chilling claim made decades later, with no fear of repercussion, and for many in Albany, it rang true. The city's political machine had long protected its monopoly on vice. If an outsider, especially one as volatile as Jack Diamond, tried to muscle in, he was removed. The aftermath only fueled the suspicion. Not long after Diamond's death, Fitzpatrick was promoted to chief of police, a rise some took as a reward for a job completed. He held the position until 1945, when he met his own violent end, shot and killed in his office by Albany detective John McElvany. McElvany was convicted, then later had his sentence commuted by Governor W. Averell Harriman. Another political mystery, another buried truth. In Albany, everything circled back to power. And when people looked at the list of suspects, Schultz, Weinberg, the Oley brothers, it was easy to see motives. But only one group had both motive and the ability to erase evidence, silence witnesses, and make the official investigation evaporate. The Albany Police Department. Whether they pulled the trigger, protected the killers, or simply looked the other way, the message was unmistakable. Jack Diamond didn't die because of a gang war. He died because he stepped into a city run by men who didn't tolerate outsiders. For all his bravado, all his escapes, and all his narrow survivals, the one force Jack Diamond could never outrun wasn't a rival gangster. It was a political machine. After Jack Diamond's murder, the woman who had stood beside him, through trials, raids, and nights that bled into sunrise, found herself suddenly alone. Alice Kenny Diamond wasn't a showgirl like Kiki Roberts, nor a gangster strategist like the Underworld wives in the Bronx. She was a quiet presence in Jack's loud life, a woman swept into a storm that never truly belonged to her. When Jack died, newspapers splashed her name across the front pages. Photographers caught her crying over her husband's body at 67 Dove Street, whispering, "I didn't do it," like a prayer or an apology. For a moment, she was a tragic figure in a very public story, widowed by a man who lived and died under headlines. But tragedy has a short shelf life in the underworld. By 1933, Alice was drifting through Brooklyn, trying to survive on the scraps of Jack's broken legacy. She attempted to leverage his notoriety, sometimes telling her story to people who wanted a glimpse into Jack Diamond's world, sometimes aligning herself with men who claimed to be his former associates. These were not protectors, they were opportunists. Figures drawn to her because of the name she carried and willing to exploit it however they could. Alice had fallen into the orbit of dangerous people, men who understood that information, real or imagined, was worth money. And in a world where Jack Diamond's enemies were still active, still paranoid, and still settling old scores, Alice's proximity to the past made her vulnerable. On July 1st, 1933, she was found dead in her Brooklyn apartment. A gunshot wound to the head. No struggle, no clear suspects, no answers. The police treated it as a murder almost immediately, but behind closed doors, the whispers began. Had someone silenced her? If Jack had stolen money, failed a deal, or betrayed the wrong men, Alice might have been the last loose thread. Some believed the killers wanted to ensure she couldn't reveal anything. Stories Jack told her in confidence, details she'd picked up by listening, or secrets she didn't even realize she possessed. Others felt she was a casualty of an underworld where connections, even old ones, never truly die. What made her death even more haunting was how quickly the case faded. There was no prolonged investigation, no powerful figure pushing for justice, no newspapers elevating the story beyond a few brief columns. Alice Diamond's murder was swallowed by the city, as if her life and her death were simply footnotes to her husband's legend. She had tried to make sense of the world Jack left behind. Instead, she became its final victim. The story of Legs Diamond didn't end with gunfire in Albany. It ended in a quiet Brooklyn apartment 2 years later, in a silence deeper than the one that followed his death. Alice had survived Jack's life. She couldn't survive his shadow. In the years that followed Jack Diamond's death, the world moved on, quietly at first, then with an almost embarrassed shrug. A man who had once dominated headlines now lived on mostly in rumors, memories, and the kind of half-true stories traded in bars after midnight. Yet his legend refused to disappear. If anything, it grew sharper around the edges, shaped less by fact and more by the myth of a man who survived everything except the last knock at his door. Some of the people closest to him tried to hold on to that myth. None succeeded. Marion Kiki Roberts, the showgirl who danced in the Rainbow Room the night before he died, enjoyed a brief flare of publicity in the aftermath. Reporters chased her for quotes. Theaters wanted her name on their marquees. For a short time, she became a symbol of the glamorous outlaw life New Yorkers loved to gossip about. But the spotlight dimmed quickly. The work dried up. Her connection to Jack Diamond, once a shock, became a burden. She faded into obscurity, one more performer swallowed by a city that always looked toward the next act. Others fared differently. Salvatore Spitale and Irving Bitts, the men rumored to have backed Diamond's doomed European narcotics venture, managed to land on their feet. Despite whispers linking them to Jack's murder, they found new notoriety in another, even larger scandal, the Lindbergh kidnapping case. Their involvement wasn't criminal, at least not openly. They positioned themselves as intermediaries, self-styled spokesmen for the underworld, eager to help retrieve the kidnapped baby. Some saw them as opportunists feeding on tragedy. Others saw them as relics of the same criminal ecosystem Jack had once navigated. Either way, they lived on long after Diamond was lowered into the ground. And then there was Jack's legend, the piece that truly survived. The newspapers had always called him the clay pigeon of the underworld, a man who caught bullets the way other men caught colds. He took shot after shot, stumbled, swore, and stood up again. To the public, he became an outlaw folk hero, someone who lived fast, lived defiantly, and dared to treat death like an inconvenience. But legends rarely match the truth. Jack Diamond wasn't invincible. He was reckless, stubborn, charming, and dangerous. His survival rate had less to do with destiny and more to do with luck, and luck always runs out. Yet people kept telling his story. The myth outlived the man. Even the place where he died became part of that story. The boarding house at 67 Dove Street, once just a modest brick building in Albany, turned into a morbid landmark. Decades rolled by, tenants came and went, and the house kept its secrets behind freshly painted walls. In 2023, it sold again, this time as a townhouse, its new owners inheriting a quiet slice of history they could never entirely escape. The address carried its own shadow, the place where the man who couldn't be killed finally was. But the deepest mysteries of Jack Diamond's life never found resolution. The failed narcotics deal in Europe still hangs over the narrative like a storm cloud. Did Jack steal the money? Did he lose it? Was he set up? Did he owe the wrong people too much? Those questions remain unanswered, and they color every theory about his final betrayal. Did Dutch Schultz want revenge? Did Spitalian Bits demand payment? Did the Albany machine step in to protect its monopoly? Or was it a combination of all three, the underworld and political world meeting in one violent intersection? Nearly a century later, the truth remains buried beneath layers of speculation. What survives is the pattern: a man who lived loudly, died quietly, and left behind a trail of bodies, betrayals, and broken loyalties. Jack Legs Diamond became a legend because he refused to fall. He became a myth because, in the end, he did.